The year was 1994. The grunge movement was still riding high, Friends was premiering on TV, and the internet was just starting to trickle into homes. It was a time of transition, a world caught between analog and digital, between flannel shirts and pixelated graphics. And in the midst of it all came Mortal Kombat II, a game so bold, so brutal, and yet so wildly entertaining that it didn't just make headlines, it changed the course of gaming forever. So let's start out by taking a step back to understand the cultural backdrop in 1994. At that time, the United States was grappling with major events like the signing of the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, and the introduction of the Violence Against Women Act. Globally, Nelson Mandela became South Africa's first black president, signifying a new chapter for that nation. However, in Rwanda, a genocide shocked the world, claiming the lives of hundreds of thousands of people in a matter of months. Pop culture, it was buzzing too, though. The Lion King dominated the box office, while Green Day's album Dookie and Nirvana's MTV Unplugged performance, they defined the sound for the generation. Meanwhile, in the movie theaters, Pulp Fiction was redefining cinema with its non-linear storytelling and razor-sharp dialogue. And in the world of video games, the console wars between Sega and Nintendo were at their peak. They were raging. And little did they know that right up there on the horizon was a new challenger, Sony's PlayStation. This was a world that was ready for something. It was ready for something groundbreaking and revolutionary. It was primed to just explode. Something with an edge. Enter Mortal Kombat 2. The original Mortal Kombat had already made some massive waves in 1992, with its digitized graphics of real people in the game and its infamous fatalities. Created by Ed Boon and John Tobias, the game pushed boundaries and sparked conversations about violence in video games. But Mortal Kombat 2? That was on a whole new level. Released in arcades in 1993 and later on the home consoles in 1994, Mortal Kombat 2 expanded on everything that made the original great. The roster ballooned to 12 fighters, introducing some now iconic characters like Kung Lao, Kitana, and Mileena. The environments became much more dynamic. They featured acid pits, eerie forests, and those fatalities? Even more creative and gruesome. They also introduced some fun things like friendship and babalities. But Mortal Kombat 2 wasn't just about shock value. It refined the gameplay mechanics, introducing a much more fluid control and deeper strategy for gameplay. It was the perfect mix of accessibility and depth, appealing to both casual players and hardcore fans alike. Today's gamers will never understand what it was like to have to go to the arcade to play the newest and latest and greatest games. Home consoles just simply didn't have the power to reproduce the graphics or the gameplay that we had at the arcade. The giant arcade cabinet, it allowed for suitcase-sized circuit boards that had all the processing power available at that time. So Mortal Kombat 2 in the arcade, that was the quintessential way to play the game. However, in 1994, the home console launch brought that game into millions of living rooms. Available on platforms like Sega Genesis, Super Nintendo, and later on the Sony PlayStation, the home versions were remarkably faithful to their arcade counterpart. And unlike the heavily censored SNES version of the original Mortal Kombat, MK2 was released in its full, uncensored glory across all the consoles, allowing players to experience all the blood, all the gore, and all the fatalities that made the arcade version famous. For many gamers, the home console release marked the first time they were really exposed to competitive fighting games. It wasn't just about beating the computer anymore, it was about mastering the moves and linking together some combos and fatalities to simply dominate your friends as you're playing on the couch. The ability to bring the arcade experience home changed the way that people interacted with games, making them a staple of social gatherings and cementing Mortal Kombat 2 as more than just a game. It was a cultural phenomenon. Retailers, they couldn't keep copies on the shelves. The game's launch was accompanied by a flood of strategy guides, magazine covers, and even hotline tips for players desperate to uncover every secret character and every stage fatality. It was an event, not just a game launch. This is where my story comes in. In 1994, when these games launched on home consoles, it was in September, and my birthday was coming up in October. I was at the time 11 years old, turning 12. and I had had Mortal Kombat 1 on my Super Nintendo that I bought actually at a pawn shop. But I was super disappointed in the fact that my friends who had the Sega Genesis version, they were able to play with the ABACABB or the infamous Dullard, DULLARD code, and this would unlock all the awesome points of Mortal Kombat 2. You had the blood code, you could have big head mode, you had secret characters, you had all these amazing things on the Mortal Kombat 1 version of Sega Genesis, but unfortunately for us SNES guys, we didn't have that fun stuff. But there I was, 11 years old, turning 12, and all I wanted for my birthday was Mortal Kombat 2. I knew it was launching a month or two before my birthday, and I asked my mom and my stepdad, I said, can I please have this game? But more than that, I needed more than just the game. I needed permission to get the game. See, in '94, there was a lot of talk about violence in video games, and is this going to be too much for kids? Is this going to turn them into serial killers? Is this going to make them warped and terrible people? As we'll talk a little bit later on in this video, it actually went through Congress to try to ban these games. And so my parents, they were charting uncharted waters as well, trying to figure out how to navigate this with their children. See, I was the first generation to grow up with these games, but my parents, they were the first generation trying to parent gamers. And these things went hand in hand. On the morning of my 12th birthday, I walked into the living room and my mother handed me a card. I opened up the card, and it was a wonderful birthday card, but written at the bottom was, "You have our permission to buy Mortal Kombat 2. And there was $60 in cash so that I could buy the game. This was monumental. We ran out to the store right away, I bought it, came home, plugged it in, and immediately was swept into the game. You see, I've never been much for fighting games, but Mortal Kombat 2, Killer Instinct, Street Fighter 2, these early versions of games, they weren't nearly as hard as they are now. You didn't have 50 string combos to try to put together. You didn't have these masterful things where you could counter and parry and all these crazy things that could make you a master at the game. Mortal Kombat 2 was just simple fighting. Yeah, you had to master the mechanics, you had to learn how to jump, and you had to time it right, and you could absolutely be a dominating force in the game, but you could also be a 6-year-old just button mashing and honestly have a decent chance of winning any match that you're in. MK2 was a pivotal game in my gaming career growing up. I bought the strategy guides, I bought the magazines, I bought everything. I like to show off the fatalities. We would just jump into a match and say, just don't touch the controller, let me kill you really quick so I can show you what happens. It's so crazy. People had never seen anything like it. And the only thing that drove a wedge into our gaming experience was the console war. What was better, the Genesis or the SNES? By '94, home console gaming really was in its stride, and the console wars were raging on. The Sega Genesis, the Super Nintendo were locked in a fierce battle for supremacy, and MK2, that was one of the weapons they used to battle each other. See, unlike the original Mortal Kombat, which suffered from censorship issues on the SNES, MK2 was released in full, uncensored glory on both platforms. This meant blood, guts, fatalities, zero compromises. For many gamers, choosing between the Sega and the Nintendo version came down to some subtle differences in gameplay and graphics. The Sega's version had slightly faster load times, but Nintendo had some crisper visuals. That's why I chose it, and because, hey, I didn't have a Sega. But either way, MK2 sold millions of copies, solidifying its place as one of the best games of the 16-bit era. MK2 wasn't the only landmark in gaming that year. The Sony PlayStation launched in Japan, teasing a whole new era of 3D graphics and being a huge sign of things to come. Rare had Donkey Kong Country push the SNES to its absolute technical limits. That game will get a whole video in and of itself, so hit that like and subscribe. And don't forget about Doom. That really brought the first-person shooter into mainstream consciousness. Gaming was evolving rapidly, and MK2 was at the forefront, proving that video games could be both art and entertainment. And then it almost came to a crushing halt. See, as Mortal Kombat 2 soared in popularity, it also ignited some furious debates about violence in video games. By '94, the controversy surrounding Mortal Kombat had contributed to the actual creation of the Entertainment Software Rating Board, ESRB. Now, this is the industry's self-regulatory body that was created by Congress to make sure they oversee video games so that they're not becoming too violent and too bloody. I remember congressional hearings on video games. They were actually talking about banning these games from across all platforms, but I think it backfired, because when you started slapping M for mature on video game boxes, every 10 through 17-year-old kid had to have that game because they knew it had some stuff in it that we had to play. Suddenly, before we knew it, games were getting rated just like movies. M for mature ensured parents knew exactly what they were buying. That's right, folks. Mortal Kombat 2 is directly responsible for those letters that you see on every single gaming box for the last 3 decades. Let that sink in. This game had that big of an impact on not only society, but the entire way that we play and buy video games. Hindsight being 2020, like I said, the backlash really only fueled the game's appeal, because nothing says play me to a teenager like telling us you can't. Mortal Kombat 2 wasn't just a game, it was a phenomenon. The characters became pop culture icons, spawning action figures, cartoon series, and even the live-action movie in 1995. I remember that movie, and I loved it. It may have been campy, but it really cemented Mortal Kombat's status as more than a game. It was a franchise. Arcades became battlegrounds for players mastering combos and fatalities. Kids traded tips on how to unlock secrets like hidden characters and stage fatalities, and the phrase, "finish him," it became a cultural touchstone. We still hear that and say that today. This is recognized by people who've never even picked up a controller. Looking back today, Mortal Kombat 2 is remembered as a masterpiece of its era. It set the gold standard for fighting games, influencing titles like Street Fighter and Tekken and Virtua Fighter. Its impact extended way beyond gaming, shaping discussions about art, censorship, and the cultural legitimacy of video games. For those who played it in 93 and 94, MK2 wasn't just a game, it was a moment. A time when you gathered with friends around an arcade cabinet or a CRT TV and you pulled off a flawless victory. You felt like you conquered the world. 1994 was a year of change and possibility. The internet was growing, politics were shifting, and pop culture was thriving. And in the midst of it all, Mortal Kombat 2. It reminded us that games could be more than just a pastime. They could be an event. So here's to Mortal Kombat 2. A game that didn't just make us press start, it made us think, cheer, maybe break a controller or two, and, perform some fatalities on our close friends and family. Finish him? No. I think we're just getting started.